Hello everyone, we're going to make a start. First of all, welcome. It's so great to see you all here, and whether you're in the room or online, we really look forward to having a great afternoon together. We're gathered here today to talk about the state of hostels in 21st century Britain, a really important question. And we do so with mixed emotions. Why? Because we think of my late friend and colleague, Jeremy Swain, whose hard work and dedication were very much behind what is for us a program of work. It's much more than the report that we're going to be talking about today. Without him, we wouldn't be here, and it's so fitting because he worked for 34 years at Thames Reach to be doing that today. So it's wonderful to be here together, and we think of Jeremy as we do so. So today is very much about coming together to reflect on the state of hostels in Britain, and we're so grateful to Thames Reach and to all the other partners who've been with us from the beginning. So very large hostel providers, from Centrepoint to Thames Reach to St Mungo's to Simon Community Scotland. This is a journey that we're embarking on together. So we're going to have a great discussion. And to kick us off, we're going to have Michelle, my colleague Michelle, talk about the findings of the research. Over to you, Michelle.
I'll start without my laptop. Yeah, we just skip it. Yeah, next one. So hostels, obviously those, I started my working life in a homeless hostel. I left uni with my useless history degree and went to work in a hostel. I play a really significant role, they always have done, and they are right now playing a significant role in the homelessness crisis response. And what our report was sort of starting to do was to say, well, what exactly is a hostel in the 21st century? What role should they play in the 21st century? And this project, as Lydia says, the start of a sort of much bigger conversation about hostels, was about trying to understand the diverse landscape of hostels in the UK. I've got my slides working, you'll be pleased to know. So what did we do? What we did was we partnered with the Cambridge Centre for Housing and Planning Research to conduct a comprehensive survey. We surveyed 317 unique hostel sites in England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. And what we wanted to do was gather together the insights from across that landscape of services to develop a more evidence-based typology to understand hostels as they are today, and for it to be a building block for evaluating the different models and types of hostel. So what did we find? A lot. I've got 10 minutes, so I'm going to rattle through this and just pick out some of the highlights and hope that you can read the report, which was launched on Tuesday. So in terms of physical characteristics, despite there was a lot of variety, there were some large projects, 50 plus beds, accounting for about 15% of the total, and then quite a lot of small hostels, hard to delineate really between hostels and supported housing. A third of projects had less than 10 bed spaces. What was kind of interesting to me was that note that we've added there, which is that you would think that purpose-built newer hostels would have been built smaller, but on average they were bigger, the purpose-built hostels, and we don't quite know why. What we think is that's probably a feature of the need for economies of scale and the funding and the support and what that costs. Kind of pleasingly, shared rooms seem to have largely disappeared, consigned to history. Only 3.5% of the entire sample required residents to share rooms, and around a quarter of rooms had access to a kitchen or a bathroom. This isn't very surprising. Who stays in hostels? Very mixed. Hostels are very generalist in this day and age, a mix of ages, a mix of genders. There was a small number of women-only services, about 8%. 25% of the sample just worked with young people. Interesting again, odd sort of thing, is that a quarter of the hostels surveyed didn't have an upper age limit. And maybe that's expected, but some of them said they worked with people at 16 and above. So that working with 16 to 18-year-olds, that's a group that's legally classified as a minor. So that was kind of surprising. We also looked at the sort of groups that were targeted and excluded, the approach to admissions. So did they target specific groups? Did they exclude specific groups? That kind of thing. The most commonly used criteria for targeting acceptance and exclusion was age and household composition. So that won't be a surprise, I don't think. A lot of hostels excluded families, excluded couples, and some only worked with particular age groups, as we've already said. I think the couples is interesting. So I think it was about 2/5 of the sample excluded couples. People without recourse to public funds, that's an obvious one. It says that 20% of the sample excluded people with a local connection. That's kind of surprising to me. I was chatting to someone about it before we got started. You would expect that to be a larger proportion, I think, than we found in the survey sample. And we're not quite sure what that is. I think it merits a bit more investigation. And the main point, I think, is that hostels are forced to, have to, or do exhibit significant flexibility. So hostels are taking people that they were not commissioned to take. So in the report, you'll see some really interesting stats about the number of people with learning disabilities that were in hostels relative to the number that targeted that as a specific group. The sort of 80% of hostels took that group, but only, I think it was less than 2/5 were supposed to work with that group. Same with prisoners, same with people with physical health issues. It seems to be the case that projects are working with people that they were not commissioned to work with. And obviously that's an issue if projects are not staffed to the level or degree of specialism that you might expect for those kind of client groups. In terms of support in hostels, again, probably what you would expect. Most of the services provided 24-hour cover, over 70%. If you think about what we said about 1/3 of hostels have got less than 10 beds, though, that suggests that there's some very expensive services out there, small numbers with 24-hour cover, and that might account for what we see later in terms of the cost. People with substance misuse, mental health, all of the sort of obvious types of support services are provided. I think for me, there was something about the use of psychologically informed or trauma-informed care. That was one of the questions in the survey. And I think over 90% of people said they offered psychologically informed support. I'm not sure if that could possibly be true. I'm not sure if that's become a bit meaningless in the sense of how that's understood by people and what that actually means in terms of the support that's provided. In terms of move on, it was very interesting. I think that overall, people were staying longer than expected. In short stay hostels, so your 6 to 12 month hostel, people were generally staying on average twice that length of time. For 3 to 6 month hostels, the same. So in terms of move on, the shorter period hostels are not really achieving shorter periods of stay as intended. Hostels reported that about 1/3 of their residents, most hostels said 1/3 of residents moved on positively, but quite a sizable chunk of sort of sideways moves within that, so moving between hostels that were intended to be temporary, and a significant proportion of people who are just leaving hostels negatively. So about 20%, what I think was the largest sort of proportion, evictions and abandonments. So there's some work around move on pathways and the amount of negative moves and whether hostels are working in the way that perhaps they are intended to in terms of length of stay. The economics of hostels. We had about 80% of the hostels in the sample returned detailed financial information. And I think what surprised me is quite a lot of the narrative around hostels is that we can't really afford housing first for everybody, and hostels achieve these economies of scale. You can help a lot of very complex people in one place. But the findings around the finances suggest that the average yearly cost of a hostel bed is very close to the average cost of a housing first unit. There were some real variations within that, from some hostels that were very cheap, had no sort of support funding, were existing with sort of fundraised income at quite a low level, and at the other end, several hostels that cost $1 million plus a year to run. So it's an average. Within that, there'll be quite a wide range, but it still feels like quite an expensive solution for people in the context that people are staying longer than they should, and the outcomes aren't always great, and I think that merits further examination. And then in terms of impact, outcomes and value for money, I think the sort of takeaway message is that at the moment it's quite difficult to assess hostels, both their value, the outcomes they're achieving relative to other providers. You know, everybody measures quite a lot of things in every hostel: client satisfaction, level of support needs, you move on, whether they're accessing support services, but not in a way that means you could measure effectiveness very well or compare one hostel to another or benchmark or anything like that, really. It's sort of a lot of information, but not being used particularly well in terms of understanding effectiveness. And in terms of what happens next, that's the key bit of this conversation, really. The reason I've rattled through it and hope that you've read the report is we want to hear from you, really. We're going to have a discussion now. So following the report launch, we need to think about what are our next steps together. And during this event and after this event, we've got a lived experience session to talk about the report in a couple of weeks. We need to gather views from you and others about what would be the most interesting, what would be the most impactful to explore next. And that's what we want to hear from you today. Where would you prioritise your efforts if you could look at this crisis pathway, hostels, assessment beds, you know, the whole kit and caboodle? And we've got some ideas. So with that in mind, just to think about, you know, do we need a standardised framework for data collection across hostels? I've just made that point that the data's very bitty and there's a lot of it and it's not matched very well. Specialisation, do we need that to be the conversation? We've heard that hostels are very generalist, lots of different client groups mixed together. Is that a problem? Well, how would we decide what works? How would we scale what works? How would we test what works? And what kind of support programmes do we need in hostels that might facilitate improved move on? So that's just some ideas of what we can talk about in the conversation, but anything that might have struck you in reading the report, we're interested to hear about that too.
Thank you so much, Michelle. And now I'd like to welcome Bill Tidman from Thames Reach and Lorraine McGrath to the front with me and Michelle to have a discussion about the project. Thank you so much. Let me...
And again.
Thank you, cool. Thank you. And it'd be great to start by asking Bill, and thank you again for having us today, to talk a little bit about Thames Reach, what you do, and what attracted you to the project.
Thank you. So I think Michelle described us as a large hostel provider earlier, and I don't think we are a large hostel provider, actually. We're a relatively small hostel provider. But hostels are an important part of what we do. I think as an organisation, I would say that we deliver outreach services, we deliver tenancy sustainment services, and we deliver some prevention services, and so on. Hostels are a part of that, but not sort of an end in itself. And I think that really affects how I think about hostels. I think often hostel providers per se think about the success of the hostel. And I think we try not to think about the success of the hostel as itself. We think about how is it helping people move away from homelessness and stay away from homelessness. And I think at the moment it's a bit problematic, to be honest. I think part of that is the way that hostels are funded, very dependent on housing benefit, as you've heard. And I think that drives, so that's a system set up for settled housing, really, and it's set up for stability. And I think what we're trying to do is run accommodation that's by its nature unstable. We expect people to spend less time there. We don't want people to settle in and spend the rest of their lives there. We want them to spend a limited amount of time there and move on to somewhere better and more permanent. So there's a conflict in between the way that hostels are funded. So, you know, based on how the hostels are funded, we want people to stay there forever and never change, never get a job, nothing like that. That would work really well, and the hostels would work really well. But it's not what hostels are there to do. So that's a really big conflict. We're being driven in different directions. It also doesn't fund really, you know, the funding, what we're being paid for is mainly to run the building through that housing benefit. We're not being funded to understand what people need, to link them with the services they need, and to get them into somewhere more suitable. So that's a real big question. Just lastly, and you can move on, I think that hostels are often seen as a place of last resort, So I think in the report or in the blog somewhere, Michelle kindly refers to the comment I made about them being mongrels, in the sense they're trying to do lots of different things. And I think that's right. I don't think the answer to that is necessarily specialisation, but it's a recognition that you can't just dump people there and leave them there. There's a real advantage to it, than being flexible and to accept people with a wide range of needs. But if they're going to do that, they need to be working with people for quickly and moving people on. And there are lots of, it's not just about the support that's provided, it's about the availability of accommodation. But we need to get to grips with that.
And Bill, would it be fair to say that all of those are reasons why you wanted to...
oh, sorry, yes, and that's why I wanted to get involved.
No, that's great, thank you. Lorraine.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm delighted to be part of this conversation, and we were delighted to be invited to be part of the initiative in the first place as well. So Simon Community Scotland delivers end-to-end homelessness services mainly across central Scotland, with some national programmes where we work in partnership with people across the country. And that's from prevention, working with housing providers, through to providing our own accommodation in House the First as well, and all the measure of services in between, including outreach and the provision of emergency and temporary accommodation, some of which would fall into the typology of hostels. What attracted us to be part of this is that hostels is a catch-all term for a very wide range of provision. We don't really categorise anything that we do as hostel provision, but it does fall into that category in terms of how it's funded and how it's described within the system. It's a much misunderstood area, and it carries an awful lot of kind of old-fashioned perceptions from a public perception point of view and even a system perception point of view. It's changed. Our experience of working with people has changed in terms of even the 12 years that I've been with Simon Community Scotland has changed dramatically. The level of risk that people experience day in, day out in their lives, and therefore the staff that support and care for them experience day in, day out, has been heightened. Access criteria to other services has gone off the scale. So what we have is a system that we think about as hostels as being the kind of end point in the system, but actually it's the place of safety. It provides a safe place for people who cannot find a safe place anywhere else, which is great, but it's not well understood what that actually means in terms of the wider system integration that's required to actually change any of that and to make improvements within that system of accommodation and support, which is what hostels are. And I get frustrated with how little people end up remaining within our accommodation because there aren't the housing options out there for them to move on to. We tend to be a bit obsessed within the homelessness system of you're not a successful outcome unless you have your own front door key and a tenancy agreement. A lot of the people that we see stuck in the hostel system across the country, that's not a solution that they want or that they need, but we plan for the majority, but not necessarily recognise that we need to do something different for that important small minority. And the research is really helping highlight that as well as other aspects.
Thank you, Lorraine. And that's it, right? Even though so much money goes into it, it plays such an important part. It always has. There will always be some need for it. We knew so little. I mean, it's incredible that a simple survey of what we have hasn't been done until now, right? It's the largest ever conducted. And that tells you something. It tells us something useful in itself, right? I wonder, though, and it's a question for all three of you, what was the most surprising thing, or a couple of things that emerged from this first stage of the work?
Michelle, you know it better. You go.
I have read it, so yeah.
I've read it too.
I mean, there's quite a bit, I suppose. I mean, I don't know if I'm surprised by there's things that annoy me more. Like, so I'm bothered about the fact that we can't find a solution for couples. I'm bothered by the exclusions, I think, a lot. and I'm bothered by the obsession with categorisation and you know, eligibility criteria, and I think that's one of the weaknesses of hostels, isn't it? You are trying to do too much in one building. You have to put parameters around it, but by definition that's excluding people, and I don't know what that means for the people that are excluded, like what's their offer. So we had some service visits this morning. Thames Reach took us around a few buildings, and quite a lot of the time the conversation settles on the person has to have this amount of need, but not this amount of need, and you know, those kind of things. And I think there's a lot of that in the report about, about the different categories and categorisations. And I feel like we should do better. Maybe that's something outside of hostels to accommodate the people that can't fit in hostels, or maybe hostels need to change, but that struck me. Yeah.
Or the crisis pathway in general.
Yeah.
I mean, I suppose, again, it's questions, really. You when you see something like that, you ask
More questions.
Yeah. So they look like they're some really small hostels.
Yeah.
What's that about?
Yeah.
You know, 24-hour hostels, presumably with less than 10 beds. How does that work practically?
Yeah.
Some of the stuff about, I can't remember the percentage, but for me, a relatively low percentage of hostels allowed managed alcohol and drug use.
Yeah.
I find it difficult to imagine how you could have a hostel unless it was a very specific, 12-step recovery hostel that didn't allow that. I mean, I remember when I started in this line of work, there were lots of hostels did that, and I worked in a day centre at the time, and every morning people used to come in and say, I've been excluded from it, I've been evicted from the hostel because I turned up drunk. And that was, that you'd see the same person every day. And, we had many more hostel bed spaces then. So there's stuff like that, but I think it's just, when you see something like that, you say, and, tell me more. So, yeah.
Fantastic, thank you, Bill. Lorraine.
Yeah, I think, Michelle, there's quite a lot that, I could rant about, I think, for quite a while. But I think some of the more, what was it, surprising? It's the range of models. I think the fact that probably even I had the perception that some of the larger scale hostels were still shared, were still, needing some way to go. So that was really encouraging to see that there is much more self-contained space within the hostel environment. One of the things that really kind of wound me up was that the percentage of hostels that accept pets. I thought we had gone way beyond that in the 21st century, that we understood the importance of that. And I think the fact that we're not necessarily gearing up the hostel system to respond to that level of complexity of need, that whilst most had 24-hour staffing, there wasn't necessarily a kind of a sense of how that staffing related to the complexity of need that would be in the building at any time. And then when you look at the financial costs and relative to other kinds of supported living or accommodation with support, just how all that is stacking up around a model that is the last place of safety for an awful lot of people who have not managed to sustain anything else, or who have not been sustained in other spaces because they've not, certain parts of their lifestyles or the choices that they make were not understood in other spaces that they had been in beforehand.
Thank you, Lorraine. We'll open up to the audience in a moment, but I just want to go a little bit deeper on the exclusion and the targeting before we do. So in relation to exclusions, we found through the survey that couples, people in relationships, are one of the groups, another one, people without a local connection. What does that mean for them? And actually at a time when we know that there's more foreigners than ever rapidly becoming street homeless, what are the implications for the system as it is and could become in the next 2-3 years? On
the local connection, I think the obvious it's the fragmentation, isn't it, of the system and the localisation of the funding and the services, and your quite small geographical footprints. Local authorities, principally the funders, are under pressure. But I think that idea that people are just moved around until they find somewhere where they have a satisfactory local connection, or that the area in which they live doesn't have the kind of service they need, but the area next door has exactly the kind of service they need. You know, that is what's very frustrating about the landscape of hostel and housing provision, I think, at the moment. And there's got to be something we can do better in that space in terms of joining up and commissioning at a greater scale. I mean, the couples issue comes with domestic abuse a lot of the time, not always, but often, and it presents some extra challenges. But it's a peculiar thing that we would rather someone was on the street than in safety. Is that me? Am I rasping?
You're fine,
I'll stop.
I think. We're okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I was interested in the couples. I wondered whether that meant that people weren't being housed as couples, but we were being housed as individuals. That seems to me to be more understandable, but I may be wrong.
I read it as aligned relationships, right? And knowing that, a bit like pets, people need connection. Mm-hmm. This idea that you're not going to be in a relationship if you're in one of these places. Again, we need to know more, but it's an interesting question too.
The way I understood it, which may be wrong, but would reflect how we work in our services, that each partner in a couple would get their own tenure and be allowed to stay there. Not that we're saying you can't have a relationship, but saying we're not going to give you one room to share because we recognise that relationships may break down, and as you pointed out, there may be violence or abuse in that relationship. There won't always be, and we will move people out together. So I don't know, I may be wrong, and it may be that people won't house people who have relationships, and I think that's not a good thing.
I think it is that.
The latter.
I do, I honestly do.
Yeah, and I'm shocked at that in that case,
yeah.
because I can't see any rationale.
I don't know why you would say it on an exclusion criteria otherwise, because what you would say is we'd house couples by putting them in different rooms. The fact that you say we exclude couples, and I think Amy will tell us in the Target 1000 group in London, couples are massively overrepresented within that group of people that are stuck on the street because they can't be accommodated. Often it is domestic abuse in that situation too. Yeah. Yeah. So it's linked to that as well. Yeah.
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 I mean, well, I think each partner ought to have their own room, and they can choose what to do about it, and that would generally be our approach. But I may be completely wrong, and I think we should ask more questions about it, because it's quite shocking if we're saying we won't house people because they're in a relationship, which is so true. Yeah.
The other one, Bill, that's more relevant in London is local connection as well, right?
Yeah,
because
absolutely.
during COVID, if you don't have it, suddenly things happen super quickly.
Yeah.
So why do we have it?
I mean, I think that's not the choice of providers. That's generally the choice of commissioners and the condition of the funding they've got. However, I think it's interesting. Michelle's pointed this out, but I mean, where hostels are and where provision is, has got nothing to do with need. It's got to do with where it was built 30, 40 years ago, generally. Even if it's not the same.
100 years ago.
100 years ago. Because I mean, if you look at dock areas of London, they have quite good levels of provision unless they got rid of it. That's why it's there, not because the need's there. The need may be there or it may not be there. But we have real disparities between neighbouring areas with similar current levels of rough sleeping, of street homelessness. So we have boroughs where kind of they're struggling to fill up their stock. They want to keep it all full so no one can get in. Because if someone gets in, they're taking responsibility for new people. So it's very much, it's for our people. But then in the neighbouring borough, they have no stock and they're spending money on hotels or people spending money on the streets. So we, you know, there are kind of lots of arrangements we propose around boroughs sharing, goals around, you know, one of the concerns about this is that boroughs take on people long term. They have social care responsibility to them. So someone moves from random boroughs, Newham to Tower Hamlets, and then that person has quite significant care needs. The worry in Tower Hamlets is that they're taking on the responsibility for those care needs. And I think that's solvable as a problem. I don't think we need to necessarily build new hostels, but we need to use what we've got much better.
Indeed. Lorraine, what about Scotland? How do these exclusions play out there?
In terms of couples, I think probably we have a lot of single-sex accommodation options. We tend not to have as many large-scale, 50-bed plus. The largest one that we would operate would be 15 beds emergency service, and they tend to be single-sex. So I suppose that by definition precludes the accommodation of couples. I think the point about funding is probably one of the key things though, because so many hostels are dependent on housing benefit income and single rooms. Then how do you accommodate a couple in a single room together and still manage the housing benefit income, which in some cases, like there's one of our services where it's close to 70% of the income that covers the whole budget, that's housing benefit. So any kind of dent in that is quite a big issue. So I think probably that would be my sense that that's why it's been played out in the way that it is in terms of the exclusion around couples. Not necessarily a good thing, because whilst we can be really concerned about risks in couples because of domestic abuse, we should also be supporting people to live the life that they want to live and have the relationships that bring support and care and nurture to them. So we're really missing that opportunity. In terms of local connection, thankfully we don't have that challenge because that's not something that applies to Scotland anymore. Much to the distress of some local authorities, to be fair, but we don't have the need to prove local connection in terms of accessing homelessness services or to be accommodated in that area anymore.
Thank you, Lorraine. And turning to the targeting question, why do we have so many generalist services when we know that we have many different subpopulations and they may have things in common but also very different needs, and they may be at different life stages?
From an outreach point of view, we have people on the streets, we need to get people onto the streets. What I don't want to do is people to be waiting 6 months for a specialist bit of accommodation that perfectly meets their needs. I prefer to have people in and safer while we understand what people's needs are. And I think a lot of the time those needs can be met with people living their own accommodation rather than something else. But I think there's room for specialism, but I think there's a danger of over-specialising, keeping people on the streets longer.
I wonder if it's a question of, is it a question for the homelessness system, or is it a question for the wider care and support system? Because there are people elsewhere that come through a different route to need that same level of support, whether it be mental health, addictions, learning disabilities, acquired brain injuries, even physical disabilities and learning disabilities. But if they come through a different route, then they're responded to differently within the system, from within the wider health and social care system rather than through the homelessness route. So is that the question? You know, why are they not being served by that group to the point where we're sitting here having a conversation about how we specialise hostels to respond to that group? And it'd be interesting to see, you know, if we can tease that agenda out, just how big a proportion of the people in those hostels actually have a primary need that's an adult social care need.
And I wonder if this question ties with the question of cost. We found that the costs are significant. There's lots of money going into support. Is this the right way of organising ourselves? And if the cost for the client is that high, should people just be placing housing first? That's the question that's raised, Michelle.
I think that's right, and it's a bit of a sausage machine, isn't it? Streets, assessment centre, hostel, supported housing, house. And one of the arguments for that is its rapidity, it's rapid in terms of off the street, but also it's more cost effective. I always hear that. And if it isn't more cost effective, if you think about the inefficiency that's within that system, then I think there is a strong case to be made for housing first. I also think it means you can meet the specialist needs of people because it's self-contained, you're not trying to mix people. I think some of the mixing of need is a feature of the fact that at one time there would have been a specialist hostel for, I mean, people that are old like me will know this, a specialist hostel for London for over 55s who drink or something. And then as that got fragmented out into local authorities, those hostels then become all things to all people because they don't have enough to fill a specialist scheme in an area. So I think there's a bit of that in it too. I'm not sure housing first is right for everyone though. I feel like for people with higher needs, but for people with lower needs, we just need to find a different crisis pathway that doesn't put people through what seems like, you wouldn't design it. If you had the choice to design it now, you wouldn't design it so it looks like it looks now with all the hurdles you go through and all the different assessments and all the different stages to your journey out of homelessness. And that tells you that it needs a review, I think.
Indeed, which is why this work really matters so much. We're going to open it up to the floor. Who would like to share their reflections, questions? We'll take a couple of the time, and we may have some online as well, people. Over here. If you could say who you are as well.
My name's Susan Smith. I'm head of support at Your Place in Newham. We are, exactly as you described, Bill, a classic Mongol hostel. We've got 155 bed spaces. Yeah, it's big. And we've got multiple contracts feeding into that, and we have everything from people who are very, very low support. We have a high proportion of people who come through the NAS route and ended up on the streets after being put out of home office accommodation. But the other end, we've got some really complex people with long-term histories of trauma, rough sleeping, substance misuse, alcohol, T1000 type people, though I don't think we've actually got any T1000 at the moment, but that type of people. What struck me when I read the report and come in and looking at Michelle's presentation today was around the length of stay. And for me, that breaks it out into two areas. We have the low to medium support people who could move on, but there's nowhere to put them. We can't let them into PRS because of LHA rates in London. They don't want to be in PRS, and we'll quite often just point back refuse because they don't want to move in a shared house with a load of strangers, which is understandable. We have a few, some people with clearinghouse rights, or I probably shouldn't say rights, but who are eligible to be referred to clearinghouse, and that's great, that works. But at the other end, we have a cohort of people that there's just nowhere for them to go. Complex needs, physical health needs, often coupled with long-term drug or alcohol use. They need 24-hour support, but highly vulnerable to exploitation, so housing first would be appropriate. And they're just with us, which would be okay, because if it's somebody who has long-term alcohol issues, for example, social care, sheltered accommodation is not going to work with them. We can work with that, we can manage that, but we get no additional support. We can't get additional support for care packages. We're not catering, so staff basically end up, we've currently got 2 people that staff are running over and getting ready meals for. So I think addressing those 2 issues will make a substantial difference. Addressing the issue for rapid move on for the people who can, but also the long-term appropriate accommodation for the people who can't. There's just nowhere for them to go. So that was my thoughts.
That's a really good summary. Thank you so much. Anyone else? Do I need to look at the chat, Craig? Is that... Ah, okay, Tor.
So yeah, we've had a few questions online. I suppose just on the on support as well. That's coming through quite a lot in the questions. Is there also kind of a lack of support outside of hostels? Is that part of the reason that people can't move on from services? And what additional services do we need to look at within hostels themselves?
Thank you. And there was one here, and then we'll take answers before.
Hi, Luca from the Treasury. I'd be interested to get your thoughts on what should the hostel system look like in, I guess, A, now, like what does the ideal hostel look like right now, and then B, in a world where homelessness more generally, the system is better, the wider housing system is better. Is there a fundamental role for hostels in the system, or do they exist as sort of a point of last resort that actually shouldn't exist if everything else works?
It's a great question. Let's take these three. Michelle, did you put your hand up?
No, I was just pointing out that Jenny had a question.
Yes, so we'll do this
Okay,
next
sorry.
round.
Yeah. I don't know what I was doing. Yeah.
Shall I say something about
Please.
the question
Yeah.
about support? I'm interested in that. So the support outside hostels, does that exist? And I think it's really patchy. It does in some places. So one of our services, tenancy sustainment teams, was started in 2000. That's why I came to Thames Ridge. By, at the time, central government as part of the House Sleepers Union. It's important to remember that when that started, the tenancy breakdown rate in clearinghouse accommodation, so social housing accommodation provided specific for people who've been sleeping rough, was around 50% a year. So the chances of you surviving that tenancy for a year were only 1 in 2, so really low. With the tenancy sustainment teams, their job was to support those people. It then moved to 97% sustainment and has remained pretty close to that. So that's a big service. It's an expensive service as it is, but it supports a lot of people. So per head is not that expensive a service, and it makes a real difference. We had an expansion of that sort of support, both at the prevention end, but also at the other end, 15 years ago, 25 years ago. That was easy stuff to decommission when local authority became short of money. Whereas hostels are far more difficult to decommission because it's obvious. So that's one point. The second point is that, so one of the services we've recently been doing as a pilot, funded by the GLA, has been to look at whether, in terms of moving on from hostels, so that bridging the gap out of hostels, whether additional specialist, in inverted commas, but dedicated resources that can work with people. The job is just to say, how can we help you move on? Someone who doesn't necessarily work in the hostel, but can challenge the hostel, because I think there can become a kind of groupthink in a hostel that people can't move on. And just a fresh pair of eyes can really help with that. So we've been doing that. It's been really interesting, actually. I mean, I think it has demonstrated there's a shortage of move on, and that move on, even where it exists, is quite difficult to access. But more people have moved on. But also, just the kind of, I would say there are kind of three categories of how hostels have responded to that. One is that they're just overwhelmed and they're just grateful of extra resources. There's other that where they're slightly protective. Our people are special, so that's great, but it's not for our people. And then some actually defensive, saying we're really worried about someone coming in questioning our judgment. So I think that's something, for those reasons, that we should be doing more of that probably, and just that challenge in the system. So it's about hostels not existing for hostels. It's about how does it link into the rest of the world. And I think that's a way of helping us get access to kind of the, those people with really complex needs. So how do we help them get access to the resources they need that don't depend on them being in one place?
Thank you, Bill. And certainly all the questions are related in a way, because the ideal hostel is very much linked to the ecosystem and the responsiveness of the wider system around it, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think the ideal hostel doesn't exist because we do need emergency. All right, apologies, I will, yeah, is that better? I was saying that the ideal hostel is the hostel that doesn't exist, because that kind of provision is something that we don't necessarily need. We will always need an emergency response and a crisis response, but the scale that we have at the moment of that kind of provision is too much. We want a system where we are catching people much earlier. They're not developing that level of complexity of need, that level of entrenchment within a system when there's nowhere to go. It's about having emergency responses that are genuinely short-term, but also genuinely trauma-informed and self-contained and respectful and dignified in the same way as we would treat people in any other part of the adult social care system. We do this separateness and this different response for people coming through the homelessness system that is hard to understand. So I think to do that, we need to think about prevention, first of all, and catching people at a much earlier stage and having that early warning system across all our communities where we pick people up at a much earlier stage, but also even those who have the complexity of need, that we have a different response for them, that it's much more about having a much wider range of supported living, permanent supported living options for people coming through the homelessness route with significant adult social care needs, in the same way as we think about people coming through any other part of the system. Because we wouldn't be planning hostels for any other group, or thinking about what the hostels need to look like for any other group.
So true. More questions. Let's do another round. Jenny, you were first, and then gentleman at the back.
Hi, I'm Jenny from Hostels. I've got some reflections because I'm really like to talk about reflections and then a question. So because we are living since the Ice Age, if you kind of go back and you think about, so I started my career in homelessness in 2004. And I was sort of reflecting as you guys were talking and thinking about what are the changes that we've seen. So, you know, we had supporting people, we had leading places of change, which made the buildings far better environments. They're now quite tired. And if you think about the evidence, now it was imperfect. There was, 5 domains, Bill, do you remember, from supporting people, living your best life and whatever. Yeah. But there was a consistent way of measuring, and it upped standards. And then post-2010, given austerity, and I completely understand that, having worked at a local authority, specification of services grew. So that it got tighter and tighter, and you had generic commissioners, or you were sort of told this is the current issue that we need to solve, so put 68 people in a hostel with complex needs, mainly substance misuse, so you have like a building of 68 heroin addicts. That's exactly what's happened. But where we have fallen into really difficult stuff, and I know Mr. Eastwood from the GLA will echo this, is we end up warehousing people. Because, so for as much as the rough sleeping, drug and alcohol treatment grant came out, it was like, we're going to treat everybody. What it's done is put people on methadone, which is fine. It's a really good harm reduction technique. What we can't do is get people through to detox and then rehab, because the social workers won't put them through unless they have a place to go afterwards. What we've done is ended up warehousing people, and I think this study was illuminating, I suppose, what would be even more interesting is the interdependencies from some of those, and where government, treasury, whomever have decided, okay, we're going to fix this small problem, and maybe Carol Black's review of treatment services was great, but it's being implemented in very piecemeal ways. And if we think about 68 beds in central London of heroin addicts, which is a real thing, they can't go through to treatment. So they stay there and they get worse, and then they cycle through, they do sideways moves. So I guess my ask to you guys would be, if we were to explore further research, start to articulate what that looks like, how do you guys think that could play out? That was a very long observation, sorry, I talked about it.
That's a very good one, and we'll go into detail in the second session of our next steps, which we'll pick that up then, but such useful reflection, Jenny, thank you.
Hi, my name is Ross Watkins. I work for a hostel that's got low support needs for accommodation. One of the things that I've seen through most of the outer boroughs is the complete lack of accommodation options for people with low support needs. I've seen so many people over the last 3 or 4 years develop alcohol issues, drug addictions, then finally get accommodation above them. We've only got 48 beds, we can hardly accommodate everyone. There needs to be more provision for people without the higher support needs. That seems to be what the hostel system's geared to more and more now.
Thank you. Anyone else before? Yeah, the back.
Hi, I'm Jeremy Nicholas, I'm from SHP. Hi Jenny. I'm responsible for, I think, for the hostel that you were referring to. And the position we're in, I think, generally, is where we have hostels, we have sumps. These are places that just hold the risk for the rest of society. And whereas before, going back to a point that you again made, Jenny, of 2004, just after supporting people came in, prior to that, most of our sector was funded directly from central government. We were paid through a housing benefit via housing related support. And we were also allowed to operate across London rather than by borough. And I think there's an argument now for us to look at the contingent that gets referred to as the T1000s and look at them in a pan-London way in a much greater degree. Because from what I've seen over the course of the last 30 years now, is we're going back to a point where we need to have a pan-London response to the to the worries that we have in running on a local authority basis. The other thing I'd say is that at the point of supporting people coming in, and I remember those days very well because I was working with Tom, in Camden what we did was we were able to fund specialist posts within services which picked up a lot of the role that we look for the statutory sector to provide. If you look at right care, right person, we've lost the support of the police, we've lost the mental health response. So again, it just exacerbates the problems that we see in running hostels where we're just holding all the risk. One other point that's not come through as yet is we talk about running psychologically informed environments. Most of the time I don't think that's true because you have to get that environment to be psychologically informed, not just the people that work or live in it. But what I've seen particularly over the last 4 years since COVID is how trauma is beginning to increase for the staff that we have running services. And they are getting to a point now where they are not able to cope with it. So my question is, I think, can we get back to that position of recognizing that generic generalist hostels are actually specialist in what they do and that they are therefore able to get the kind of funding that we need in order to operate those specialisms. The only way I think that's going to work is through integrated commissioning, and we're seeing how difficult that is currently. Thank you.
Thank you. Tom? 2 minutes. So I suppose we're going to look about next steps for the project in the next session after the break. But I think a good way of wrapping up this particular element would be to pick up these questions, but also to really share reflections about any big bets that can make a difference pretty quickly, right? And Jenny, you mentioned things like places of change that made such a change to the landscape in the UK in the 90s. Michelle, something we were talking about yesterday was how one of the things we found in the survey is that there's more new purpose-built hostels, of like larger hostels. So it raises the question of, are we going in the wrong direction? Is this the point to stop and reconsider? So places of change. Another one, that I've been reflecting on recently is that suddenly when you hear about places like Finland, like Denmark, and moments in history that made a difference, they usually involve things like big initiatives that turn hostels into housing first projects, congregate housing first. So is there a world where that should be considered? But thirdly, do we have the right systems to be able to make those decisions, though? Because there's so many unintended consequences to big calls like that. Currently, do we have all the data and all the systems that we need to then be more strategic and commission, you know, in a different type of way? So, any reflection on the questions we had and these big things that we could actually invest in? Who would like to start?
I think funding is really important, and I think it could make a difference. At the moment, we fund the government, local authorities fund beds primarily. They don't fund support. They may fund supported beds. That drives us to provide services in hostels. In the last Labour government, there was a lot of credit given to the Rust Sleepers Unit around reducing homelessness. I think the decoupling of support from accommodation was just as big, in that people could be supported and their homelessness could be prevented. So I think we need to look at that again. I'm not saying revive supporting people, but that idea, we're being driven to fund services to people with complex needs. The only way we can do that is through rent, which means we need a building. So it's worth thinking about.
And why not ask it, right? Why not supporting people?
Also, what we've heard today and when we went out to some services this morning is it's really obvious that the crisis pathways don't begin and end with local authorities and hostels. So we're talking about people coming out of prison into a hostel for 28 days where they're going to go into a sort of set of steps eventually. Why do that? If you've got someone in prison as a transition moment, why is your crisis pathway into homelessness services? Why does that happen from hospital? Why does that happen from asylum support? Why aren't we looking at those crisis pathways across a range of areas and departments? We understand what the drivers of homelessness and rough sleeping are in a lot of places, and those crisis pathways shouldn't be leading to the door of your assessment centre or your place or whatever else. So you're missing all those opportunities. It's not that far upstream. People are in institutions where you
actually incarcerated.
Yeah, you know, or in other types of institutional care where you could do something with them. So yeah, there's that. And I think just the other point about support for me is that connection to your community, that we put someone in a flat when they've been in a hostel with people 24 hours a day, and we put them out in the community and expect them to thrive without wrapping support, connectedness, social networks around them. That's always been a problem, and I think it's something that we can't keep ignoring. Yeah.
Thank you, Lorraine.
About what support looks like and the level of support that is being provided by staff in hostels who are, and in a really unrecognised way, is a really important thing for us to really drill into and understand more about, that the level of health and social care need that is being held, responded to, and in many cases resolved with people through the relationships largely that they have with staff over the 24-hour period. But it's not recognised or valued how big a part of the process that is. And it's, a hostel is perceived as an accommodation option. It's not perceived as a health and social care support option. But actually it's probably more a health and social care support option than it is an accommodation option for an awful lot of these guys. And huge part of that is the relationship, and I think the point that you've made about move on, that you know, people fall off a cliff edge from that relationship when they have to leave, and the longer they've been with that team and within that environment, then the bigger a high risk transition that is for people to then be on their own in the community without all those relationships. And it won't just be with staff, it will be with everybody else that's involved in that environment as well.
And that's such a critical point, because you know what this question already raises, what is a hostel in 21st century Britain, is that question of what should a crisis system look like? And it quickly becomes very apparent that what we have currently is not a crisis response system. It's just the opposite. It takes too long, it's incredibly costly, and this is at the expense of outcomes and society more broadly. So what this project is all about is, what system do we need that's truly a crisis response system? So this is what we're in for. And we're so excited and so grateful to have partners like you who've been with us from the very beginning. And we look forward to the second session. We're going to have a 5-minute break. But first of all, let's thank our speakers. And we'll be back in 5 minutes. You can do it over coffee.
session of our event, What Makes a Hostel in 21st Century Britain. I'm delighted to be joined for this session by Izzy Connell, who's Deputy Director of the Homelessness and Rough Sleeping Directorate at the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government, and by Katie Dalton, who's Director of Cymorth Cymru, which is the voice of the homelessness and supported housing sector in Wales. First of all, I'd like to thank our guests for their colour coordination. I'm bitterly regretting that I didn't wear a teal T-shirt myself.
Next time.
But Izzy, perhaps I could just first ask you to introduce yourself and say a little bit about your role and how this work relates to it.
Super. Thank you ever so much for having me. I'm really sorry that I missed what I've heard over lunch in the break with some fantastic visits earlier today. So I lead one of our homelessness and rough sleeping teams within the, I think we can still call it the department rather than referring to it as the ministry. And that has included, amongst other things, funding over the past 4 years or so, after probably quite a big break since probably the Hostels Capital Improvement Programme, funding a kind of series of ventures into this space. And it's quite interesting, the conversation we've had about what exactly a hostel means and how hostels and supported housing intersect and overlap and the rest of it. But there's been quite a number of programmes that I've been involved in the 4.5 years or so I've been in this role, including the rough sleeping accommodation programme, all of these, quite flexible but focused mostly on move-on accommodation with support, the night shelter transformation programme, so focused on the non-commission sector and that move within the night shelter sector towards more self-contained accommodation, again a theme we've talked about quite a lot today, and the single homelessness accommodation programme, focused, again, pretty flexible, but focused on that kind of longer term, more complex needs, supported housing part of the sphere. Those things all really intersect, but actually one area that I think we've probably done the least focusing on and the least kind of targeting in our programmes in England in recent years has been this sort of hostels gap or space, recognising that we don't yet have that clear typology. So I think this is a really timely piece of work, shows us both what we know and an awful lot about what we don't know. I think what I'm most interested in is thinking about central government's role in some of this, both directly and both in terms of work in that relationship with local government that has changed, I think, quite a lot since July as well, but also really trying to get, in terms of next steps on this for me, I think what's really interesting is thinking about what works and what doesn't work and how we take an understanding of what hostels look like into how we can collectively at the various tiers of government, at the local government level, at the kind of combined authority or pan-London level, and at a central government level, kind of take that and use our resources more efficiently and deliver better outcomes for individuals and for the system. So really excited, but see this very much as the beginning of a conversation.
Thank you, Izzy. So Katie, if I were to go to Wales, which I am next week, I'll be in Swansea, and I were to start talking about a homeless hostel, would they know what I meant in terms of what it means in England?
So I would say, Pnawn da, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Diolch, for inviting me along today to speak. I would say that there are services that would refer to themselves as hostels, organisations that would say they provide hostels, but it's not the language that we tend to use in discussions at a national level about policy development and funding. So, we still have the successor to supporting people in Wales. It's now called the Housing Support Grant. It remains ring-fenced, and that's absolutely critical. And in recent years, we've managed to successfully campaign for increased funding. So in comparison to some of the comments earlier, there is that support element of the funding that means that you have slightly more flexibility than just having to rely on housing benefit. But hostels is not really a word that we use at national policy development. We tend to use temporary accommodation, emergency accommodation, supported accommodation. So this piece of work is really interesting to see what is the typology, what do we mean by hostels, what is included in the definition, what's the breadth and diversity of provision out there. So I think it's a really great piece of work, and I think certainly thinking about it from a Wales context where, you know, certainly since COVID and with the previous Cabinet Secretary responsible for homelessness, a real move away from shared spaces towards self-contained provision to try and make sure that people are living with dignity, that they have their own access to, you know, where possible, private bathrooms, cooking facilities, etc., to try and make sure that something that may be temporary in nature is still something that is of good quality for people. And of course, you know, thinking about this within the context of moving to rapid rehousing, you know, we know that Scotland has been ahead of the game with that move. Wales decided to kind of make a move for it at probably the worst possible time that you could try and embark on rapid rehousing during the pandemic, and where we've got, you know, the biggest housing crisis for decades. But nevertheless, that commitment is there. It continues to be a commitment in Wales. So where do hostels fit within that journey where you're moving away from a staircase model, moving much more quickly towards putting people into settled accommodation, whether that be with no support, low support, or something down the other end such as Housing First. So really interesting conversation. And I think, you know, we can't talk about what we want in the future if we don't know where we are now, and this piece of research is absolutely critical for that.
Thank you. And Izzy, I know that you're in a slightly constrained position in that the spending review won't be announced until June. Then there'll be a cross-government ending homelessness strategy after that. But what can you tell us about the priorities of the new government as they've been signalled to you? And what do you think might be different in things like the role of the combined authority, which I certainly think seems to be a change in emphasis for the new government? So what is the vibe?
That's a great question. So I think what we are definitely seeing, and what I'm sure all of you are seeing and feeling, is a really strong commitment from this set of ministers to tackling homelessness and rough sleeping, and a real breadth of emphasis across the piece on different types of homelessness. And I think we went through quite a period of strong focus within from previous sets of ministers around rough sleeping, which remains a real emphasis for this government, but that kind of broader focus and increase in prioritisation around prevention and around families, and particularly those kind of real challenges around families in bed and breakfast. We've seen that come through really strongly. I think what's important to say, particularly in an audience here in an event where we're talking about hostels, is I very much see that not as at the expense of our ministers caring about rough sleeping, but a recognition, which I think came through in the earlier conversation that we had about this is a system, and looking at one part of it in isolation is not a helpful way to look at that system as a whole. So I see that as a really positive thing and not something that undermines the priority that this government gives to rough sleeping. And we've seen that over the course of this winter with a very large additional amount of money that the Deputy Prime Minister has been able to provide, focused on kind of emergency and winter type accommodation, and preventing, that real focus on preventing homelessness and rough sleeping. We've also seen that prioritisation in the 25-26 SR, and I am hoping that I'll come in 6 months' time and be able to say something more about the priority that we're seeing that. But this is definitely an area of work where the Deputy Prime Minister is very personally focused and engaged as well. I think the wider kind of environment, the other kind of really relevant change here is that increasing focus on freedom and flexibility and trust in local government. and in moving away from what are, and I've been responsible for plenty of them myself, multiple funding streams with excellent setup and design and delivery, but also with a real challenge in terms of administering that for the sector and in terms of managing all these different pots of money that do slightly different things. So, and we've seen that already in the context of thinking about next financial year, and I think that's a theme that we'll continue to see being really, really important. Also, as you said, a really strong commitment to the strategic role of mayors and of combined authorities. I think we're still working through what that means when it gets down to the nitty-gritty, and I think there are some really interesting conversations happening within combined authorities themselves about the role they want to play and how to kind of play that strategic and convening role and work in partnership with those parts of the system, local authorities, local housing authorities, that have those responsibilities for our statutory homelessness system as well. So that's something I think we're all working through together, but it's going to be really important for us.
Now, Katie, we were on a visit to a Thames Reach hostel this morning, and I was going down a corridor and saw a note stuck on someone's door of someone's room, and it said, "Don't open door, cat may escape, have a nice day, smiley face." Now, you represent the supported housing sector in Wales. We've heard before from Lorraine about the fact that some hostels, some supported housing settings won't allow pets, and I've heard many stories of people who refuse to come in from the street because they want their pet with them. What do you think could be better about providing accommodation, supported accommodation for people and their pets?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a big supporter of people being able to bring pets with them into their accommodation. I think that, you know, when so often the world and all of its systems has let someone down, their dog or their cat has been that one constant that has been there to listen, give you a bit of a hug when times are tough, and also on a very serious note, sometimes the responsibility that a person can feel for looking after their pet is the purpose that keeps them going every day, so can be a matter of life or death for someone. So, you know, of course there are challenges sometimes with having pets on sites. It would be naive to suggest otherwise, but I think that services should be as flexible as possible to enable people to come in with pets, because it is such a lifeline to people. And, you know, one of the reasons that we see people on the streets is because they couldn't find accommodation that allowed them to bring their pet in. So I think it's really, really important that that happens.
And a different question for you, Katie. What do you think is the role of government in a programme of work such as this, where we're trying to reimagine the role of hostels? And you've been very involved in policy and implementation in Wales. So what's your observation of an effective role for leadership and implementation that government can play?
Yeah, I think the leadership in government at a national level is incredibly important. I think, you know, for me, we have always campaigned really hard for the ring fence to be maintained around what was called Supporting People and is now called the Housing Support Grant in Wales, because we know all too often that when local projects are being developed and going through planning committee, there will be a bunch of concerned local residents who, you know, do not want that in their backyard, who then put pressure on local councillors, who then go out of their way to make representations to stop that being built in their ward. And what having, you know, something like a ring-fenced funding pot that sits at national government level in Wales, where ministers are a little further removed from those local pressures and can say, this is funding that has to be spent on this sort of project. This is what it's intended for. You can't spend it on anything else, so crack on and make it happen. I think that that's really, really important. I think also leadership when it comes to some of the barriers that people face in terms of accessing accommodation. And we're about to have a new homelessness bill be laid in the Senedd, as with, you know, the civil servant language around the season in which it's going to be laid keeps changing, but assurances before the end of this Senedd term. And, you know, the white paper looked to remove things like intentionality, to abolish priority needs, some of those barriers. And again, those are things that local government can find very challenging. So when it's discretionary, and the housing supply is really challenging. They may lean on that to ration and gatekeep access. If the national government is going to be really clear about this is a point of principle about what we want the system to look like in 2025 and going forward, then that's really helpful because, you know, I think there are many people in local government who want to do the right thing, but the system that they're working in makes things really, really difficult for them. So the role of leadership, both in policy setting and in providing ring-fence funding, is, in my eyes, absolutely critical for the government of that nation.
Thank you. And Izzy, I'd like to ask you about experimentation and evaluation and the role of the department in particular towards this, because what we want to do, having first of all mapped, if you like, the current homelessness sector across the UK, we'd like to identify different types of service that we could then work with partners to try as a trial, then evaluate and test the impact. And so that is a test and learn approach. Sometimes it may not work as intended, sometimes it may be brilliant. What is the attitude in the department towards this test and learn approach, as it were, where you're not quite sure what you're going to find when you embark on a journey, but you're seeking change and to capture and evaluate the learning along the way?
So as you'll certainly know, Lydia, when was it we commissioned our test and learn? Gosh, has it been that long? So I feel like that kind of test and learn, both the language and the intent, is very much been a part of what we've been thinking about within the homelessness and rough sleeping directorate for some time now. You know, the current we published, I think, what was it, just yesterday, the first report of the systems-wide evaluation that the department's commissioned and that CHI and a wider consortium. That's one of those words I always forget, consortium, has been delivering, but that's accompanied by a test and learn programme. And actually that kind of language and focus around test and learn has been, although this originated under the previous administration, that philosophy, I think, has very much continued and, if anything, strengthened that focus on public service reform and the role of, and the ability to not always get everything right, but still test and trial that, I think is very much one that this government seems really enthusiastic about, and that's quite exciting, I think, personally, and I imagine that others share that view as well. I think we will need to work through what the role of central government long-term will be in that. As people who've been involved in things like the Rough Sleeping Initiative over the past few years will know, we have historically been through quite kind of interesting and sometimes innovative co-production processes with local authorities to think about what they will spend that Rough Sleeping Initiative grant on. We are moving to a more flexible model of how that grant is provided. That relies to some extent on local authorities leading some of that innovation and that willingness to take risks locally on the things that they try and trial. I think part of our role within central government is to, so far as possible, produce kind of useful advice, support and guidance to enable people to make good decisions, but understanding that innovation carries with it some risks.
Thank you. If I can ask you for a brief answer on this, it's a big question, but can you see a world in which the new government wants mayors and combined authorities to take a more strategic and active role in commissioning, convening of services such as hostels across an urban area, but at the same time, would your department be comfortable with devolving certain funding pots that can be pooled across government services for a place, perhaps on a much smaller level? In a sense, those pull in different directions, but if you think of convening services around people and their needs, they can coexist. Would you be comfortable, do you think, as a department?
So I think, as you said, there is a real kind of interesting tension there. Also, the MHCLG is in some respects quite unusual in central government in that the department does not deliver an awful lot directly ourselves. So often when you're talking to a government department about devolving responsibility, say, to a mayoral combined authority, you're talking about central government giving up something that currently it delivers directly nationally and giving that responsibility to a combined authority. MHCLG does not do a lot of that. A lot of the stuff, you know, our work on homelessness and rough sleeping is not, generally, it's not delivered nationally. The legislative, the statutory responsibilities and the funding are with the local housing authority tier. So the question then about, are we talking about devolving or evolving those budgets? I think it creates different challenges and questions. I think definitely there is no barrier to that pooling of local authority budgets at a combined authority level. There is also a much wider and really interesting and strong kind of push in the devolution white paper, for instance, around moving to strategic authorities, moving to a greater number of unitaries, which really changes the landscape in that respect, particularly less. We've kind of perhaps naturally had a bit of a London conversation, not entirely, and helped by having colleagues from Scotland and Wales in the room as well. But London's quite different in that regard. When you're talking about counties and districts, it's a very different sort of picture and quite a big and profound change in terms of that commissioning landscape.
Yes. Katie, just finally, we are very keen to work in partnership with providers of hostel services, with commissioners, with others, and we do, as I said, want to experiment with new models. Do you think among your members there's appetite for this work?
Yeah, I think so, and I think something that I'm particularly interested in, I spent the last session and most of today actually agreeing with Lorraine constantly with all the points that she's making, but I think the role of health and social care within the context of this, I think that too many of the people who end up within the hostel system or the homelessness system are people who've experienced significant trauma and adversity, but have also been failed by other public services along that way, often from a very, very young age. So I think thinking about where those other public services could have intervened. So if we look at the hostel population and we look back at people's life stories and life journeys, where is it that a difference could have been made by another agency that would have stopped them getting there? So really looking at that prevention piece. But then also looking at, whilst there is a demand for, a provision for a group of people who have that co-occurring complex kind of support needs, what are the much more substantial role that health and social care can play? And I feel too often, and particularly speaking to frontline workers, and we're really proud to run the frontline network in Wales, is that homelessness and housing support workers feel that everything is kind of left to them because the system has failed a lot of the people that they support, and they've been thrown out of mental health services, they've been assessed as either not complex enough or too complex for social care services, when really that's where the responsibility should lie. And we have a bunch of amazing, incredibly skilled support workers, but who are paid absolute pennies, picking up the role of several statutory agencies to try and support this person, which is often life-changing and life-saving. So I think looking at the role that health and social care in terms of co-commissioning, not just having staff that drop in, but really co-commissioning models that meet the holistic needs of people.
Thank you so much, Katie. I'm afraid we're out of time now. I just want to say a couple of thanks. As Michelle, our colleague, said at the beginning, this work is based on a survey of 317 providers of hostel services. We want to say a big thank you to everyone who contributed to this substantial and detailed piece of work. Thank you to all those organisations who've been involved in this journey to this stage, but we really want to continue this partnership, so please keep in touch with us. Thank you to our hosts, Thames Reach today, who've been great hosts, and thank you in particular to Izzy and Katie, my guests today. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.